June 28, 1914, 10:45 a.m. Apelque, Sarajevo. The bullet left the barrel at 1,200 feet per second. 7 millimeters of copper-jacketed lead, weighing 8 grams, fired from a FN Model 1910 semi-automatic pistol held in the trembling hand of a 19-year-old tuberculosis patient who had 3 years to live. The projectile traveled 5 feet before striking Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in the jugular vein. The second shot, fired immediately after, struck his wife Sophie in the abdomen. Both would be dead within minutes. What neither the assassin nor his victim could have known, what no one standing on that sun-drenched Sarajevo street could have possibly imagined, was that these 2 bullets would trigger a chain reaction that would kill 40 million people, destroy 4 empires, redraw every map in Europe, and fundamentally transform human civilization. This is the story of how a single act of violence by a dying teenager in a forgotten corner of Europe became the spark that ignited the most catastrophic war in human history. A war that military planners predicted would last 6 weeks, but would drag on for 4 years. A war that would introduce poison gas, flamethrowers, tanks, and aerial bombardment. A war so devastating that survivors would call it the war to end all wars, a name that would prove tragically, bitterly ironic. The mathematics of catastrophe were already loaded in Gavrilo Princip's pistol that morning. He just didn't know it yet. May 27, 1914. Belgrade, Serbia. 31 days before the assassination. 6 young men sat in a cramped apartment in the Serbian capital, planning murder with the idealism of schoolboys and the weapons of a modern military. Gavrilo Princip, 19 years old. Tuberculosis destroying his lungs. Rejected from military service for being too small and weak, he stood barely 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 128 pounds. His body was failing him, but his mind burned with revolutionary fervor. Nedeljko Kabranovic, 19. A printer's apprentice with a dramatic flair who had already attempted suicide twice. He wrote poetry about dying for the cause. Trifko Grabez, 18. The youngest of the group. A student who still lived with his parents and had never fired a gun before 3 weeks ago. Alongside them sat 3 more conspirators, Muhamed Mehmed Basic, Vaso Kubrilovic, and Kujetko Popovic, all between 17 and 27 years old. Together, they called themselves Young Bosnia, a romantic revolutionary movement that dreamed of liberating South Slavic peoples from Austro-Hungarian rule. What made them dangerous wasn't their youth or their passion. It was their connection to a man sitting in the shadows of that Belgrade apartment. Major Vojislav Tankovic, officer in Serbian military intelligence, had provided something these boys could never have obtained on their own. For FN Model 1910 pistols, manufactured in Belgium, standard issue for European armies. 6 hand grenades of Serbian military origin. Cyanide capsules for each assassin to take after the attack. And training, 3 weeks of instruction at a secret facility outside Belgrade where they learned to shoot, throw grenades, and die for their cause. The Serbian government would spend decades denying any official involvement. The evidence would tell a different story. These weren't random terrorists who stumbled upon military-grade weapons. They were equipped, trained, and directed by elements within Serbian intelligence who saw an opportunity to strike at Austria-Hungary through proxy violence. Their target had been carefully chosen. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, had announced plans to visit Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. The date itself was a calculated insult to Serbian nationalism. It was Vidovdan, St. Vitus Day, the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389 when Serbia fell to the Ottoman Empire. For the Archduke to parade through a Bosnian city with a large Serbian population on this sacred date was seen as deliberate provocation. What the conspirators didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Franz Ferdinand was perhaps the worst possible target for their revolutionary ambitions. The Archduke was no friend of oppression. His private papers, discovered after his death, revealed a man planning dramatic reforms of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He advocated for a United States of Greater Austria, a federal system that would grant Slavic peoples equal status with Austrians and Hungarians. He opposed the aggressive policies of the military party. He was, in many ways, the best hope for peaceful reform within the empire. By killing him, Young Bosnia would ensure the very opposite of what they intended. They would hand power to the military hardliners who wanted war. They would trigger exactly the violent crackdown they claimed to oppose. And they would ignite a continental war that would kill millions of the very Slavic peoples they claimed to be liberating. But on May 27, 1914, sitting in that Belgrade apartment cleaning weapons they barely knew how to use, the conspirators saw only glory. They saw themselves as heroes of Serbian nationalism. They saw their names written in history books as liberators. They had no idea they were loading the gun that would shoot the 20th century in the face. June 27, 1914. Imperial Palace, Vienna. 24 hours before the assassination, Franz Ferdinand sat in his private study, writing a letter to his friend Count Ottokar Chernin that would never be sent. "Sophie and I leave for Bosnia tomorrow," he wrote. "I have a strange feeling about this trip. The security arrangements are absurd. The route is published in newspapers. We will be driving slowly in open cars through hostile territory. Any determined assassin could strike with ease." The Archduke's concerns were not paranoia. They were tragically prescient. The security plan for the Sarajevo visit was so incompetent it seemed designed to facilitate assassination. The motorcade route had been published in local newspapers days in advance. The cars would travel at walking speed through narrow streets lined with crowds. There would be no advanced security sweeps of buildings along the route. Local police, many sympathetic to Serbian nationalism, would provide the only protection. General Oskar Podijorek, military governor of Bosnia, had dismissed Ferdinand's security concerns with aristocratic disdain. "Your Imperial Highness worries too much. The people of Sarajevo are loyal subjects. There is no threat." Podijorek was either catastrophically incompetent or deliberately negligent. Evidence suggests both. The general was a military hardliner who despised Ferdinand's reform proposals. Whether he consciously facilitated the assassination or simply failed to take basic security precautions, the result would be the same. Franz Ferdinand knew the trip was dangerous. He knew the date was provocative. He knew Sarajevo was hostile territory. Yet he went anyway, driven by a sense of duty that would prove fatal. He finished the letter, sealed it, and placed it in his desk drawer. Then he walked down the palace corridor to say goodnight to his children. Sophie, 12 years old. Maximilian, 11. Ernst, 9. He would never see them again. June 28, 1914. 10:15 a.m. Apelquay, Sarajevo. 30 minutes before the first attack, 7 assassins positioned themselves along the 4-mile motorcade route like human landmines waiting to detonate. Mehmed Basic stood at the Kamerja Bridge, a hand grenade hidden in his coat. His assignment was first strike. When the Archduke's car passed, he would throw the grenade, initiating the attack. 300 yards down the route, Kabranovic waited near the Austro-Hungarian bank. Second position, backup attacker if Mehmed Basic failed. Kubrilovic stood near the central police station, an irony that would have been funny if it weren't so grim. Third position, Popovich positioned himself near the Latiner Bridge. Fourth position, Grabez waited across from the Mostar Cafe. Fifth position, Princip stood near Schiller's Delicatessen. Sixth position, a seventh conspirator, whose name would be lost to history, waited at the end of the route. Seventh position, final chance. They were spaced at intervals of approximately 400 yards, creating a gauntlet of death that stretched the length of Apelquay. The theory was simple. If one assassin failed, 6 more stood ready. The Archduke could not escape them all. At 10:15 a.m., the motorcade departed from the railway station. For cars traveling at approximately 10 miles per hour through streets lined with tens of thousands of spectators. Security was provided by 60 local policemen who had received no special training for protecting visiting dignitaries. In the lead car, 3 local officials waved to the crowd. In the second car, Franz Ferdinand sat beside his wife Sophie. Both wore formal military dress despite the summer heat. The Archduke's uniform displayed the rank of Inspector General of the Armed Forces. Sophie wore a white silk dress with a red sash, elegant and tragically visible. General Podijorek sat in the front seat, oblivious to the catastrophe his incompetence had enabled. As the motorcade approached Kamerja Bridge, Mehmed Basic gripped the grenade in his pocket. His assignment was clear: pull the pin, throw the grenade, swallow the cyanide capsule, die for Serbia. The Archduke's car came into view. Mehmed Basic froze. His hand remained in his pocket. gripping the grenade but unable to move. Later, he would claim a policeman standing too close prevented him from attacking. The truth, evident from witness testimony, was simpler and more human. When the moment came to commit murder-suicide in front of thousands of people, his courage failed him. The motorcade passed. First opportunity lost. For 100 yards down the route, Kabranovic watched the cars approach his position. He had no illusions about survival. He had attempted suicide twice before. Today would be third time lucky or unlucky, depending on one's perspective. At 10:10 a.m., as the Archduke's car passed directly in front of him, Kabranovic pulled the pin on his grenade, struck the percussion cap against a lamppost, and hurled it toward the car. The driver of the Archduke's car, Leopold Lojka, spotted the object flying through the air. He accelerated. The grenade bounced off the folded roof of the car and fell into the street behind them. It exploded under the third car in the motorcade. Shrapnel wounded 16 to 20 people, including several officers in the following car. The explosion shattered the festive atmosphere. Screaming erupted from the crowd. The motorcade screeched to a halt. Kabranovic, following his instructions, immediately swallowed his cyanide capsule and jumped into the Miljacka River, attempting suicide by drowning. The cyanide was old, degraded by heat and time. It induced violent vomiting but failed to kill him. The Miljacka River in June was approximately 4 inches deep. He couldn't drown. Police dragged him from the water, vomiting and screaming, and beat him unconscious before hauling him to jail. First attack failed. Franz Ferdinand, shaken but unharmed, displayed the cold courage that had made him a respected military officer. While others panicked, he climbed from his car and walked to the damaged vehicle to check on the wounded. "The fellow must be insane," he muttered, more puzzled than angry. "Gentlemen, let us proceed with our program." General Podiorak urged the Archduke to abandon the visit and return to the barracks. Franz Ferdinand refused. "I came to Sarajevo on a mission, and I shall carry it out. But first, I shall visit the hospital to see those wounded by this madness." This decision to change the route, made with the best intentions, would prove fatal. The motorcade resumed its journey toward the city hall. As they passed the remaining assassins positioned along the route, confusion reigned. They had heard the explosion. They had seen the arrest. They didn't know if the Archduke was dead or alive. Most assumed the attack had succeeded and their services were no longer needed. Kuberlovic, standing near the central police station, did nothing as the motorcade passed. Popovich, near the Latiner Bridge, did nothing. Grabez, across from the Mostar Cafe, did nothing. Princip, standing near Schiller's Delicatessen, watched the cars speed past and assumed the mission had succeeded. He walked away from his position, dejected that he hadn't gotten his chance to become a martyr for Serbia. The motorcade reached City Hall at 10:20 a.m. The Archduke and his wife entered the building for the scheduled reception, leaving their fate to a comedy of errors that was about to become a tragedy. June 28, 1914, 10:25 a.m. Sarajevo City Hall. 20 minutes before the assassination. Inside the ornate building, the mayor of Sarajevo began reading his prepared welcoming speech as if nothing had happened. "Your Imperial and Royal Highness, our hearts are full of happiness over the most gracious visit with which your highnesses are pleased to honor our capital city of Sarajevo." Franz Ferdinand interrupted, his voice sharp with anger. "Mr. Mayor, one comes here for a visit and is received by bombs. It is outrageous." The mayor, clutching his prepared text, continued reading as if the Archduke hadn't spoken. Sophie touched her husband's arm gently. He calmed himself, allowed the formalities to conclude, then delivered his own brief remarks. His voice was steady, but those close to him noticed his hands trembling slightly. After the reception, a hurried consultation took place. What to do next? The original plan called for proceeding to the National Museum, then lunch at the governor's residence. But that route would take them through the narrow streets of the old city, exactly where the remaining assassins might be waiting. General Podiorak proposed a revised plan. Drive straight to the hospital to visit the wounded officers, then return directly to the barracks via Appel Quay, the wide riverside avenue they had just traveled. The route would be direct, avoiding the old city entirely. Security could be concentrated along a single known path. Franz Ferdinand agreed immediately. "Yes, we must see the wounded. These brave men were injured in our service." It was a reasonable plan. It should have worked. What no one thought to do was inform the drivers of the change. At 10:45 a.m., the motorcade departed City Hall. In the lead car, the driver followed the original route plan, turning right onto Franz Josef Street toward the Old City. In the second car, Leopold Lodgka followed the lead car, assuming it knew where to go. General Podioreck, realizing the error, shouted at Lodgka to stop. "Wrong way. We're going straight to the hospital." Lodgka hit the brakes. The car jerked to a halt at the corner of Franz Josef Street and Appel Quay, directly in front of Schiller's Delicatessen. The engine stalled. Standing on the sidewalk, barely 5 feet from the stalled car, Gavrilo Princip couldn't believe his eyes. June 28, 1914, 10:45 a.m. The assassination. Princip had abandoned his position after the motorcade's first pass, assuming the mission had succeeded. He had walked to Schiller's Delicatessen to buy a sandwich, resigned to playing no role in history. Now, by pure chance, the Archduke's car had stopped directly in front of him. The heir to Austria-Hungary sat less than an arm's length away, clearly visible, completely unprotected. For 3 seconds, Princip stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. Then training took over. His right hand moved to his jacket pocket. Fingers closed around the FN Model 1910 pistol. In one smooth motion, he drew the weapon, raised it, and fired. The first shot struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. Sophie, seeing her husband wounded, threw herself across his body to shield him. The second shot struck her in the abdomen, severing her femoral artery. Both shots were fired from point-blank range. Distance, approximately 5 feet. Time between shots, less than 2 seconds. Lodgka gunned the engine. The car lurched forward, racing toward the governor's residence. Princip raised the pistol to his own temple, intending to complete his mission by taking his own life. A policeman named Anton Mazurek grabbed his arm, deflecting the shot. Princip tried to swallow his cyanide capsule. Mazurek struck him in the mouth, knocking it free. Within seconds, a mob of police and civilians were beating Princip nearly to death. In the speeding car, Franz Ferdinand remained conscious. He turned to his wife, slumped against him. Sophie, don't die. Live for our children." Sophie couldn't answer. She was already unconscious, bleeding out from the femoral artery wound. General Podioreck, covered in the Archduke's blood, ordered the driver to the governor's residence where doctors could help. Franz Ferdinand, blood pouring from his neck, repeated over and over, "It's nothing, it's nothing, it's nothing." His voice grew fainter with each repetition. By the time the car reached the governor's residence at 10:55 a.m., both were dead. A single bullet to the neck. A single bullet to the abdomen. 2 people killed. 40 million more would follow. June 28, 1914, 11 a.m. Vienna. The news arrives. The telegram reached Emperor Franz Joseph I at 11:30 a.m. Vienna time. Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Duchess Sophie assassinated in Sarajevo by Serbian terrorists. Both dead. The 84-year-old emperor read it without visible emotion. He had ruled Austria-Hungary for 66 years. He had buried his brother, Maximilian, executed by firing squad in Mexico. He had buried his wife, Elizabeth, stabbed by an Italian anarchist. He had buried his son, Rudolf, who had killed himself and his mistress at Mayerling. Now he would bury his nephew. A higher power has restored the order which I unfortunately was unable to maintain, Franz Joseph told his aide. The emperor had despised Franz Ferdinand. The Archduke's marriage to Sophie, a mere countess, violated Habsburg protocols. His reform proposals threatened the traditional order. His death removed an obstacle to conservative policy. But Franz Joseph was old, and he was tired, and he understood better than most that his empire was dying. The question wasn't whether it would collapse, but when and how violently. The telegram landed on the desk of Foreign Minister Count Leopold von Berchtold at noon. Unlike the emperor, Berchtold saw opportunity in the tragedy. For years, Austria-Hungary's military party had wanted a preventive war against Serbia. Serbia had been growing stronger, backed by Russia, threatening Austria-Hungary's control over Bosnia. The assassination provided the perfect pretext for crushing Serbia permanently. Within hours, the conspiracy theories began. Serbian intelligence had provided the weapons. Serbian officers had trained the assassins. The Serbian government had, at minimum, allowed the plot to proceed. Whether official Belgrade knew of the plot beforehand or simply failed to stop it, Serbia bore responsibility. Count Berchtold began drafting what would become known as the July Ultimatum, a list of demands so harsh, so deliberately designed to be unacceptable, that Serbia would have no choice but to reject them. That rejection would provide the legal pretext for war. July 5, 1914. Potsdam Palace, Germany. The blank check. Kaiser Wilhelm II received the Austrian ambassador in his summer palace, already dressed in military uniform despite the early hour. Wilhelm was the grandson of Queen Victoria, nephew to the King of England, and cousin to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. He was also volatile, insecure, and obsessed with military glory. His withered left arm, damaged during a difficult birth, had left him with a psychological need to prove his strength through shows of force. When the ambassador presented Austria-Hungary's plans for punishing Serbia, Wilhelm didn't hesitate. "You can count on Germany's full support, whatever you decide to do. If Russia intervenes, we will stand with you." This became known as the blank check, an unconditional guarantee of German support that removed Austria-Hungary's last incentive for restraint. What Wilhelm didn't understand, what none of Europe's leaders seemed to understand, was that the alliance system they had constructed to prevent war had instead created a doomsday machine. One that, once activated, could not be stopped. Austria-Hungary was allied with Germany. Serbia was allied with Russia. Russia was allied with France. Germany's war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, required attacking France through Belgium. Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality. This meant that a war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia would automatically become a war between Germany and Russia, which would automatically become a war between Germany and France, which would automatically become a war between Germany and Britain. 5 great powers, bound by interlocking alliances, would be dragged into a conflict none of them truly wanted, over an assassination in a city most of their citizens couldn't locate on a map. The dominoes had been set up. Princip's bullet had knocked over the first one. July 23, 1914. Belgrade. The ultimatum. The Austrian ambassador delivered the July ultimatum to the Serbian government at 6 p.m. with a 48-hour deadline. The demands were deliberately impossible. Austria-Hungary required Serbia to suppress all anti-Austrian propaganda, to dismiss officers and officials involved in anti-Austrian activities, to accept Austrian representatives inside Serbia conducting investigations and arrests, to prosecute anyone involved in the assassination plot under terms dictated by Austria. In other words, Serbia must surrender its sovereignty and become an Austrian puppet state. The Serbian government, backed by Russian assurances of support, rejected the ultimatum on July 25th. They agreed to nearly every demand except Austrian police operating inside Serbia. On that point, they would not yield. It was enough. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination. The declarations of war followed like clockwork. Russia mobilized to protect Serbia on July 30th. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st. Germany declared war on France on August 3rd. Germany invaded Belgium on August 4th. Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th. In 6 days, 5 great powers were at war. By the end of August, their armies were slaughtering each other by the tens of thousands in battles that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. August 1914. The assumptions. Every major power entered the war with identical assumptions. The conflict would be brief, decisive, and glorious. Soldiers would be home by Christmas. Modern firepower favored offense over defense. Morale and elan would overcome industrial killing power. Every assumption was catastrophically wrong. The war they expected to last 6 weeks continued for 4 years, 3 months, and 10 days. It killed 20 million people. It wounded 21 million more. It destroyed the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires. It created the political conditions for the rise of fascism and communism. It redrew every border in Europe. It introduced weapons so horrific, poison gas, flamethrowers, aerial bombardment, that previous generations would have considered them impossible. It shattered the certainty of progress that had defined the 19th century. Before 1914, educated Europeans believed civilization was advancing inevitably toward peace and prosperity. After 1918, they knew that progress could mean industrial-scale slaughter. The poet Siegfried Sassoon, who fought in the trenches, would later write, "I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority, because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it." By 1918, everyone agreed the war should never have been fought, but by then, 40 million people were dead or wounded, and there was no way to undo the catastrophe. April 25, 1918. Terezin Fortress Prison, Austria-Hungary. The death of Gavrilo Princip. Princip never lived to see the world his bullet had created. He was too young to be executed under Austro-Hungarian law. He was 19 at the time of the assassination, 1 month short of the minimum age for capital punishment. Instead, he received the maximum sentence available, 20 years in solitary confinement. He was imprisoned at Terezin, a fortress prison in Bohemia, where conditions were deliberately harsh. His cell was damp, cold, and measuring 6 feet by 10 feet. He received minimal food, minimal medical care, and no visitors. The tuberculosis that had been destroying his lungs before the assassination accelerated in the prison environment. By 1917, the disease had spread to his bones. His right arm had to be amputated. He weighed less than 90 pounds. Prison doctors requested his transfer to a hospital. The request was denied. On April 25, 1918, 6 months before the war ended, Gavrilo Princip died of tuberculosis in his cell. He was 23 years old. His final words, recorded by a prison guard, were, "Our ghosts will walk through Vienna and stroll through the palace, frightening the lords." He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove. 6 months after his death, Austria-Hungary would cease to exist. The Habsburg dynasty that had ruled for 600 years would fall. The empire would splinter into multiple nations. Franz Joseph's worst fears would be realized, and all of it traceable, in some terrible way, to the 8-gram bullet Princip fired from a sidewalk in Sarajevo. November 11, 1918, 11 a.m. The armistice. The war that began with 2 bullets ended with the stroke of a pen in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne, France. At 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns fell silent across the Western Front. Soldiers on both sides emerged from their trenches, stunned by the sudden absence of artillery fire. Many couldn't believe it was over. The final casualty count would take years to calculate with precision. Conservative estimates, 20 million dead, including approximately 10 million military personnel and 10 million civilians. 21 million wounded. 8 million prisoners are missing. France lost 1.4 million soldiers, roughly 4% of its entire population. Germany lost 2 million. Russia lost 1.8 million. Britain and its empire lost nearly 1 million. Austria-Hungary lost 1.2 million. The United States, involved for only 19 months, lost 116,000. Entire towns in France and Belgium were erased from existence. Forests became moonscapes of craters and mud. A generation of young men was decimated. The economic cost exceeded $200 billion in 1918 dollars, equivalent to several trillion today. But numbers cannot capture the true cost of what Princip's bullet set in motion. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed such punishing terms on Germany that it virtually guaranteed future conflict. The treaty's architects believed they were preventing another war. Instead, they created the conditions for an even worse one. 20 years after the armistice, Europe would be at war again, and this time, the death toll would be twice as high. The Russian Revolution of 1917, triggered in part by war exhaustion, brought communism to power and set in motion 70 years of Cold War. The Ottoman Empire's collapse created political vacuums in the Middle East that remain unstable a century later. The harsh treatment of Germany fed the resentment that Adolf Hitler would exploit to seize power. Historians would spend the next century debating whether World War I was inevitable or if it could have been prevented. The consensus would emerge: it wasn't inevitable. At multiple points, June 28th, July 5th, July 23rd, August 1st, different decisions by different leaders could have stopped the cascade. But the decisions weren't made. The leaders who might have stopped it either wanted war, assumed it would be brief, or simply lacked the courage to break with their allies. And so 2 bullets fired by a dying teenager on a Sarajevo street in 1914 echoed across the 20th century, killing 40 million people directly and countless millions more in the conflicts that followed. The final accounting. Gavrilo Princip believed he was striking a blow for Serbian freedom. Instead, he enabled the destruction of Serbia itself, invaded, occupied, and devastated during the war that followed. He believed he was killing an oppressor. Instead, he killed the one Habsburg who might have reformed the empire peacefully. He believed he was making history. He was right about that, at least. But the history he made was one of industrial slaughter, poison gas, and trenches filled with rotting corpses. In the end, the shot that changed history forever proved a simple, terrible truth, that violence, even when motivated by idealism, even when aimed at injustice, can unleash consequences far beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. Franz Ferdinand's dying words were, "It's nothing." He was wrong. It was everything. One bullet, one war, 40 million dead, and the ghosts are walking still.